as your history teacher and as sort of my history students, it's important that we remember that we currently live in a very, very good civilization and a good society, which in terms of what it's been like in the past is very, very, very good. And it's our job to protect that. It's also our job to improve it as much as possible. So we're not fully there, but we're getting close. And obviously the fight needs to keep going with things like racism. That's hence with the Black Lives Matter movement at the minute. But it's also our job to remember that we do need to protect this system, because there's been lots of systems in the past and even systems in the modern world that unfortunately aren't as great in terms of freedom and equality as we've got here, and we need to protect that. As a historian, it's easy for us to protect it from the threats of the far right in this modern world, and I think the main reason is that it's easy to disagree with the far right. They have a lot of very specific hatreds and a lot of specific things, like they're racist, they're sexist, and a lot of people in Britain just don't agree with that. And how can you agree with people like that? But the left, the ideas of communism is far harder as a historian to warn people about. And the main reason for that is because communism on paper is such a good idea. It talks about equality, it talks about ultimate freedom, redistribution of wealth. It sounds amazing. But when you look at the history of communism and how it's played out in places like Russia under Stalin, you realise that it's actually very difficult to actually achieve on paper. And it's important to emphasise that every single person in Russia who brought communism into the country in 1917, they did so because they thought that it would make Russia better. They thought it would help things become more equal, it would make everyone more free, and it would be a great place. Instead of this sort of communistic paradise, what communism brought in Russia was mass deaths, slave labour, starvation, brutal dictatorships, a failing economy, and a poorly led country. A good example is about how poorly this country was run, that as late as the 1980s, if you wanted a car in Russia, you would have to wait 10 years. So you would go into a shop, you would pay for it, you would sign all the forms, and it would take 10 years to work its way through the government and for you to finally get your car. Very different to nowadays, where you can literally buy a car in a single couple of hours in modern Britain. And the reason why I'm trying to emphasise this is because I think communism in Russia is a very good example of how the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And what that saying means is you will have someone who's got some very good intentions who will tell you this is the way it should go because it's the best for everybody and it's about equality and all these different sort of ideas. And all those ideas have great intentions. Sometimes they can be changed, sometimes they can be manipulated by men such as Joseph Stalin to create a very nasty place. And a good example, as I keep saying, is Stalin, because it only takes one man or woman to raise to the top of a system like communism, and it can turn this all good, powerful government into a government that's very, very evil and can do awful horrors. And usually what happens in a system where you have one party in control, like the communists in Russia or the Nazis in Germany, what starts to happen is the person who gets to the top usually gets there by being brutal and destroying their enemies. And as soon as they get to the top, they make the system just as brutal as they are. And that's exactly what happened with Joseph Stalin. He got to the top through ruthless brutality, and as soon as he got there, he was just as brutal as a leader. And if you look at the examples of where communism has done, it's not just been in Russia under Stalin. Communism has been tried in places like Russia, Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these different Eastern European countries, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba, Venezuela, Korea. Overall, 46 different countries have tried communism. And in every single occasion, it's failed to work. And some historians call the 20th century the communist experiment, where all these different countries tried to find a new system that was fairer than capitalism and democracy, called communism. And it hasn't worked. And the truth is that over 100 million people have died in the last 100 years due to countries turning communist. And I want to emphasize this just before I finish, is every single one of those governments who turned communist, and every single communist in those countries, didn't turn communist thinking it would lead to hundreds of millions of people dying. They did so because it was good intentioned, which means they intended it to go well, and unfortunately it led to hell. Hence the expression, hell is paved with good intentions. So I'd like to go on to the next slide, and if you've got any questions about this slide in particular, please email me. I know it's complicated and it's important to emphasise, but this idea of communism as a far left movement is sometimes equally as dangerous as Nazism, and it's something we should be educated as historians on.